One of the fun things that we can do in Unity is we can create an object during runtime. So as we're playing a game, if we need to spawn in or create enemy bad guys, or if we're using a weapon and we've got to be able to create bullets to shoot out of our gun, then we can instantiate or create an object while the game is playing based on an event of some kind. If we're supposed to press the spacebar or the mouse button to shoot a gun, then we can go in and we can create those objects when we actually press a key. So let's start off by finding this thing called instantiate. So we're going to go in and type this one in. And instantiate brings us to an object instantiate or a network or different little things. Let's start off with just the object.instantiate. And you can see here it says clones the object original and returns the clone. So we're going to go into here and we're going to find that we have a function. The function is simply, and this is just from the object class, we've got an instantiate, the original, which is the object. So what object are we going to bring in when we create this? The next thing we're doing is the position. Where are we going to create this object? And then the rotation. What direction is this object going to be facing when it comes into the world? And it's going to return the object. So the description clones the object, and then a little bit more of an in-depth description down here. And whenever you're going into these, whenever you're doing a new, looking into a new function or a new class here, definitely take the time, read through all of the description, all of the parts and pieces here. Go through each one of the different examples down below. Make sure you're taking a look at them. And don't forget with the API that you've got the JavaScript. If you left click on top, you can also switch it to a C# or to a Boo. So depending on what language you're working with, almost always you're going to find at least those additional examples inside of the script. It's being updated all the time. So let's go in here, and you can also see also in-depth prefab instantiation discussion. This takes you also into how the editor works with it. But for our needs right now, we simply want to be able to click on a button and then create an object when we click on a button. So what we need is an object. What's that object that we're going to load? And then we need the position that we're going to use and the rotation that we're going to use. So let's go up here. To do this, we want to make sure that we're in our update function because we want to be checking on this throughout while the player is playing. We'll come in here, we'll give ourselves a little bit of space, and let's just call this, we're going to create a bullet, and we're going to do this by saying if, and since we've already looked at input, we're going to go ahead and just go straight to input. If you're unfamiliar with some of this, you can always just go in and just create the object and just create it. And if you were to put it outside of a conditional, it would just constantly create lots and lots of bullets. What we want to do is have that check first. So here we're going to say if input.keyDown So we're checking for the key down, and what key do we want to use? So we're going to go in and say, inside with parentheses, we'll say let's do this with the spacebar. So if there's input and we're checking for the key down and it's the space button, then what do we want to do? We'll just put this into a body down here. And in here we're going to instantiate, so I'm just going to instantiate, INS. We're going to instantiate what? Well, let's see. We're going to have to load up something. If we go over here to our scene, we can see we've got prefabs, and the prefab bullet. So we're going to be loading in a bullet. So what do we want to call this? Well, we've got to load it up, so we've got to set a variable first. So before we fill this in, let's go up here. What do we want to load up? We want to load a variable. And where do we want to put it from a design choice? We've got our player speed, we've got our ranges. Down here, it's a good spot to start with, and then we can see once we look back at the inspector and see if it feels like a good spot. And this is going to be our bullet. We could call it a bullet, we could call it a projectile, whatever it is we want to do. And in fact, I'm going to call this a projectile. And we'll go ahead and keep it lined up here. And this is just going to be a transform so that we can bring in the object and just load it right in through the inspector. So now we've got our name for what we're going to do. Let's go back down to our instantiate, and we're going to plug in the object. Right here's the first argument. And then the next thing we want to do is say, what's the position? Now, we could do some arbitrary position and set it up, or we could just simply say, let's just make it the position of our player. That's where the bullet's going to be coming from. Now, our alternative, though, is to actually go in and say, well, but what if I wanted to adjust where that bullet is coming out from? Do I have to subtract or add to the position to find that new location? And that's where we could actually just use another game object. We can just use an empty game object that will just give us a position in space. So let's do that instead. We're going to go back to Unity. We're going to do create empty. We've got one just about at 0. Let's just set that right there at 0. And if we wanted to, it'd be easy enough that we could just set the point here, have it shoot from the side if we had some sort of weapon mount on the sides, or if we wanted it at the very front of the object, we could set it right at the front. And for this demonstration, I think we're going to go ahead and set it right here at the front. So let's just go up with this just a little bit. We'll say somewhere right around here. We're going to we'll have it shooting right from the front of our object. Now let's call this something. Let's call this just our projectile sockets. We're going to do sockets. So this is where our object's going to be coming out from. And right now, if we move this guy doesn't go anywhere. So let's say we hit play and move. Well, he doesn't go with me, which means I need to make sure I'm linking that object, that socket, to my player character. So I'm going to go back over. I'm just going to drag and drop this onto it. Now when I do, I dragged it onto a prefab. So it's saying, wait a second, that's losing the prefab. And we can say, sure, we'll go ahead and lose it for now. We'll hit continue. It lost the prefab. It's its own object. I still have a prefab here if I look at the player. But this player doesn't have that attachment to it. So just like from before, we got to make sure that we're actually assigning that to our prefab. We want to be able to apply it to it. So if we go back over to the inspector, I've got my player selected inside my hierarchy. And I'm going to have my option to select, to reconnect, or to apply. I want to apply this so that it applies the changes from the hierarchy back to the project object I have here. So I'm just going to hit apply. And when I do, the player up here now has the socket attached to it. So now we're just maintaining our object inside of Unity, making sure that it's the same object. Alright, with that one set up, we've got the prefab on it. Right up there. We'll go ahead and go back in and we'll say, okay, so the projectile is an object I'm going to load, but I'm also going to need one more thing. I'm going to need another variable so that I can load the position that I'm going to work from. So this is going to be, let's call this my sockets, or our socket projectile. And again, we can just do a transform. And that means that we're going to do a socket for our position. And this would be dot position. And if you're wondering, well, how do I know, where that is? Again, it's going to be position. It's a vector 3, so, where is it at? The rotation the same way. And if you look down at your examples, you'll see that you've got a handful of different examples that you can work from. With this one, they're making it based on the object itself and saying the transform direction, vector 3 forward times 10. They're just adding some velocity to it. Additional ones, we've got our transform position, our transform rotation, so it's setting it to that. So let's go ahead and take ours. We're going to say the projectile. This is going to be the position of our projectile. And then we're going to take the rotation of our projectile. And that is going to let us create whatever object it is that we load into the projectile here. And we're going to be able to load it at this location. So we save it. We'll go check over in our Unity file, make sure we don't have any errors. If we do, you can always just double click on it and it'll take you back over. And if you do get an error and it's the line number, with the default editor here in Unity, you can also set up your line numbers just so you can find out where I'm at exactly as far as line numbers are concerned. And let's go back in. Let's select on our player. And on our player, we now see we've got two additional variables that the designer can work with. We've got a projectile and we've got a socket projectile. So let's go in here and let's find both of those. We can see that we've got the prefab bullet, and we can drag that across. We could drop that on top, and that sets that one up. And we've got the socket projectile, and that one is the one that's linked to our character. So I'm just going to drag that socket over and drop that one on top. Now let's go ahead and apply this so that it applies it to our prefab. And we have it set up with a space bar, so if we push the space bar while we're playing, then we should have something happen. So let's go ahead and go in. Let's hit play. And when we move around and we hit the space bar, we actually created an object. We create another object and another object. So nice and easy to create an object and make it work for you. Now, we also notice that we've got some information down here. It's saying something to us. What's it saying? It's saying unassigned reference exception. The variable socket projectile of script player has not been assigned. You need to assign it. So, if we look at it, we come in here and we say, why does it do that for us? Well, we can go back in. Let's make sure that it's assigned. It should be assigned for us. We'll clear that one out. And we can always go back to that one and check on it if we need to. Let me rotate this camera so we got a little bit better view of it. But with that, we've got it set to a position. We've got it set to the type of object that we create. And we're getting pretty close to actually making this fire a weapon and have it go in a direction. And that's what we're going to look at next.